Hello everybody and welcome to TBR's webinar, BI and Hybrid IT Adoption Fuel Consistent Demand for Cloud Professional Services. I'm Justin Sargent and I'm hosting today's session. Today's webinar will focus on findings from TBR's Cloud Professional Services Customer Research Report, a 1Q15 Managed Private and Professional Services Cloud Benchmark. TBR analysts will provide an overview of the current state of the market, including customer buying behaviors and vendor standings, and then we'll discuss the primary drivers of the market and the changes expected to materialize as a result of those drivers. If you'd like to learn more about TBR's Cloud Professional Services Customer Research Report and/or the Managed Private and Professional Services Cloud Benchmark, please reach out to myself or one of the analysts after the webinar. Now, before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to cover. First, we'll be recording today's session and posting it on our YouTube site, TBRI channel. We encourage you to visit our channel to watch this presentation or any of the previous presentations we've posted. Second, we welcome questions on the material we're presenting today. Please send any questions you have to the Q&A function, and we will address as many as we can at the end of the presentation. And finally, I'll be following up with all of you within 24 hours with the link to the recording as well as the slides from today's webinar. And I'll be following up with you via email, so be on the lookout for that tomorrow. Now let me introduce the analyst presenting today. Leading discussion today is Practice Manager and Principal Analyst for Cloud, Allan Krans. Allan is responsible for TBR's coverage of the technologies and business models at play across the cloud computing landscape. Allan works with vendors and clients spanning the public, private, hybrid, and professional services cloud arena. Our primary presenter today is Cassandra Mooshian. Cassandra is an analyst in TBR's cloud practice and is responsible for coverage of multi-line cloud vendors Dell, Fujitsu, HP, and IBM, and private cloud vendor Rackspace. She's also the lead author of TBR's Managed Private and Professional Services Cloud Benchmark. And also joining us today is Ramunas Svarcas, Principal Analyst in TBR's Professional Services Practice. You may have heard Ramunas last week during our IT Services webinar. Ramunas is focused on analysis of professional services companies, their strategies, processes, profitability, and operational dynamics in the ever-changing services industry, with considerable attention to cloud and analytics. With that, let me hand this over to our presenters.
Thanks. So this is Allan. I'll lead in for today's discussion, which I think is a very exciting time for professional services overall. I wanted to start with an overview of some of the research that we have that looks at the cloud professional services space. You can see in blue the reports that we'll draw from largely for today's presentation, but we're also covering with the, for instance, the vendor reports, about half those, about 10 of the largest SIs, we're looking at their business delivering services around cloud environments on a semi-annual basis. So a lot of it is steeped in deep vendor analysis as well in terms of the types of services and strategies that these vendors are using to help customers as they're implementing and managing cloud environments. So it does draw from that larger pool of research as well. And then also wanted to just orient a little bit in terms of how all of this ties together, as well as some definitions before we dive in. So as I mentioned, we are looking at, from the vendor perspective on the left-hand side of the slide, vendor by vendor modeling in terms of financial results, as well as coverage of the introductions, alliances, and investments that are being made within the cloud professional services space. The cloud benchmarks kind of roll that up. We draw largely from the private and professional services benchmark. For today's discussion, you'll see a number of vendor views. So that comparative view is a critical part in terms of understanding how the vendors are actually executing in the market in terms of delivering on customer expectations. And then lastly, at the top, getting direct feedback from those end users is really a great way to round out that perspective and validate some of the vendor strategies or call out gaps in terms of things that customers are struggling with or working on, and bringing that back in terms of where vendors will be going in the future in terms of helping to address those needs. So it all rounds out and fits together quite nicely. So for our taxonomy, you can see professional services is one element. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but we are segmenting particularly the private cloud as a big opportunity for the professional services vendors. So we are calling that out distinctly in terms of dedicated instances for clients and customers. And then also for the professional services on the left-hand side, this element of brokerage is becoming an increasing area of focus and growth and opportunity as more customers need help in terms of managing multi-vendor environments. The brokerage services and brokerage platforms provided by a lot of the SIs are a growing part of their strategies and a growing need on behalf of customers. So when we talk about professional services, we're really segmenting it into 4 key areas, starting with consulting and advisory, going through the systems integration. All these activities are still applicable in terms of traditional IT, but in this case, we're segmenting out the areas that relate directly back to cloud environments and cloud services for customers. And then lastly, this area of managed services, which we actually called out more distinctly with the most recent benchmark publication to look at the area of business that is managing cloud environments on behalf of customers to reduce some of the complexity and requirements in terms of both the administration as well as the operations for the cloud environments that customers are either running or consuming. So I think that's enough of the background. We'll get into the actual highlights. And so I'll start at a high level and then hand it over to Cassandra to go through some more of the detail. But I think from an overall perspective, we've tracked professional services for cloud for years, and I think seen it change in terms of when cloud initially started to grow and mature. There was a concern on behalf of a lot of the service providers that it would erode some of their value proposition, remove some of the complexity that they had built businesses around in terms of addressing client needs to integrate traditional technology together, to manage, to consult around all of that difficulty and complexity that customers were dealing with. In a cloud environment, the provider is, and still is, taking a lot of that off the table for customers, doing a lot of the back-end technology in the day-to-day running of the data centers and services. And I think what we've seen over time is, even with increased usage of cloud services, even public cloud services, that it doesn't necessarily remove all of the service requirements for customers. They still need help in terms of managing the offerings that are available, tying it back to their business process and the value that can be achieved, not just from cost savings, but also from efficiency improvements or being able to capitalize on opportunity. So kind of starting with consulting and advisory workshops is the way that services got started. But we've seen that transition, and over time, more and more categories of what are traditional professional services have become increasingly relevant for customers in regards to their cloud environments. So looking at changing outsourcing agreements as they come up for renewal, providing a similar type of service in terms of taking complexity off the plate of the customer, managing, owning, operating elements of the environment, but providing more flexibility and cloud benefits for them as those types of contracts continue to grow. So it's providing a similar service, but with a different back end, different technology, different contracting, but there is still value in that type of value and delivery for customers that SIs play a critical role in delivering. And I think the most recent case where we've seen, again, another category of traditional managed services, so managing a customer's environment for them, operating that for them, it's become increasingly sought after for customers as the complexity of their cloud environment grows, as well as new technologies emerge around OpenStack or Docker, where the skills, most customers don't have the skills to immediately be able to capitalize on that. That's a gap and an opportunity that we see the service providers coming in increasingly to fill and building businesses around. So with that, I'll hand it over to Cassandra to take us through the body of today's presentation.
Thanks, Allan. So first we're gonna go through kind of the market overview, where we see the market today, where we expect it to grow in terms of market sizing and which segments. Then we'll dive into where we see as the areas of the most opportunity for vendors. And then finally, we'll focus on the vendor landscape, who we see coming out on top, and which vendors we see as kind of the up-and-coming vendors. So for the market overview, as Allan mentioned, BI and analytics adoption and hybrid IT integrations are really, really driving cloud professional services revenue right now, especially hybrid IT. There's just so many moving pieces and the need for systems integration and as Allan mentioned, the managed services piece. So just looking at our overview of the market size, there's definitely no doubt that the market's growing. But what's interesting is this is the first time that I've seen, and I've been covering cloud professional services for 5 or 6 years now, this is the first time I've seen the CAGR under 10%. So the market's definitely maturing. There's still very healthy growth there and very much opportunity for vendors. But the whole way that enterprises are buying cloud professional services is changing. So there's not as many big implementation and integration deals that have a bunch of consulting up front. There was some lack of education in the market prior to now around cloud and the benefits of cloud, so there was definitely that need for the advisory piece. While there's still the need for all cloud professional services, we've definitely seen just the buying model change to smaller, maybe more frequent types of deals that are more one-off integration deals, or smaller but longer-term managed services deals. Driving the upward momentum in cloud professional services is definitely those hybrid integrations, and customers really just want that efficiency and the optimization of their cloud and IT resources. But even despite the increased demand for cloud professional services, revenue's just not growing as fast as expected due to budget constraints. There's definitely a lot of security issues. There have been a number of very big data breaches recently with multinational companies. So that's definitely a concern among especially retail and financial services organizations. And not to mention budget dollars. While budgets are pressured from the top line anyway, there's also more emerging technologies to be considered. So some budget dollars that may have been previously allocated to cloud environments are now being allocated to digital or to BI. So there's definitely some push and pull between the emerging technologies. And this next slide is just kind of a step deeper into that previous slide, market sizing. So this is taking a look at segment breakout and which segments are going to drive the cloud professional services market going forward. You can see that the top category, the lightest blue, is that managed services line. That's definitely showing the biggest jump in growth from 2014 to 2020, and that, as Allan was mentioning, is because of that need for the vendor involvement in managing those multi-vendor environments and making sure that the cloud environments are running properly and are protected. So you'll see also the second from the top, the ADM line is by far the smallest segment, and that's because a lot of the app development and migration revenue and work is actually realized as a traditional professional service. So that revenue is not necessarily being attributed to the cloud side of things. So much of the heavy lift is in writing all of that code and just getting the applications ready to be moved to the cloud. So really the line that we see here for ADM is really that actual move to the cloud, the migration and the implementation of those applications. And then in the consulting line, I really see that there are two camps. There's the business consulting and the technology consulting. And there's definitely messaging lately, a lot of messaging from vendors in both camps that is saying, you know, we can help you utilize cloud to promote your business outcomes. I've really seen that from especially Deloitte. You know, Deloitte's definitely by far the leader in strategy consulting, but also Accenture. Accenture's been very good at, you know, promoting the efficiencies of cloud as a means to achieving a desired business outcome. Whereas I've seen really HP and Dell in particular, and IBM, in some cases IBM kind of straddles both camps, so to speak, but HP and Dell are definitely taking the approach of, here's this technology solution, here's what we did for a company like yours, so this is how we can help you and we can tailor it to your needs, and really focusing on their technology expertise to promote their consulting capabilities.
So Cassandra kind of overviewed the overall market view. And, you know, not surprising, you know, we're still seeing systems integration as one of the biggest buckets, managed services by 2020 being the next largest, and then shrinking down into, you know, consulting, and then finally ADM. What we normally like to do is also do customer search, and the next three slides are actually slides from our customer search work on the cloud market. And the one thing I want to point out here is that these percentages are really reflecting incidence rates in the cloud market. So they don't necessarily align directly with the revenue streams, you know, because one small engagement for, you know, several $100,000 and an engagement for several $1 million ends up as one incidence or one occurrence of such an engagement. So these numbers reflect incidence rates, not necessarily the revenue numbers associated with them. And as we can see, and we've done this study in this slide stretching back all the way out to back to 2010, going backwards in history. The dynamic of the slide hasn't changed dramatically. I mean, professional services in terms of the consulting, SI, and ADM components, and now including managed services, has always dominated in the whole cloud journey. Effectively, you know, everybody's turning to professional services for assistance and help in cloud, trying to figure out what to adopt, which, you know, do we go public, do we go private, do we go hybrid, you know, which environments do we want to build, whose environments, what products and services do we want to use, what software and workloads do we want to move into the cloud, not into the cloud. These are all the questions that customers are constantly asking. And the proliferation of what's being offered as a cloud demands and continues to demand, you know, service providers and systems integrators to be able to answer those questions for their customers, because customers simply cannot spend the time and effort to do this anymore themselves. As a consequence, we're seeing definitely, you know, also a little bit of change in these four areas, in that we've seen a little bit of fall off in terms of incidence of public cloud. Private cloud continues on an upward track, and hybrid cloud is growing, but still not in any way, shape, or form at the same rate from an incidence standpoint as private cloud. Professional services dominates in terms of incidence and what people are using. And we expect this is going to continue out into the future. It's going to continue that way for quite a while. And the reason we come to this conclusion is actually on the next slide. You know, we've asked customers, okay, if you're using, you know, cloud services, have you used cloud professional services? And back in 2011, it was, you know, 30–35% were basically using cloud professional services, and another 20% were planning to use it, you know, use it when they were going to be considering cloud computing. This has seen a dramatic jump. and with the most recent research work we did in the first half of this year, people in terms of the potential for cloud professional services has really jumped to 80% in terms of an incidence rate. Everybody that's either using cloud or considering cloud is turning to professional services for help. Yes, there are some firms that still don't or do not plan to, and we expect that as kind of a normal disposition for the whole marketplace. But it certainly shows that there's a lot of opportunity, even with the deceleration we've seen in overall cloud growth. Cloud professional services is going to continue to play a key pivotal role in the way companies adopt cloud and utilize cloud and what kind of clouds they actually build. The next slide, again, is sort of a historical perspective on what's been happening. And it breaks it down into the various components. Again, this is an incident. So, as we saw a pretty rapid jump up starting to occur back in 2011 and 12 in terms of what was actually being utilized and used for, as professional services. Management, from an incident standpoint, certainly has been high throughout the period. Really starting back in 2012 and going forwards. And, even though the incidence is high, the consumption of managed services is still at its infancy. The way the whole market has been evolving and tracking is that many firms go in and get some consulting advisory help, decide they want to move a single workload or a single environment into the cloud environment. They set it up, test it, run it, figure out where all the kinks are, and then they start to consider if they want to move other environments into the cloud environment or move their whole company or as much as they can into the cloud environment, which portends for additional growth from a services standpoint and for cloud services themselves from a consumption standpoint. So I'll let Cassandra take over from here.
Sure. So this slide, we feature this in our Cloud Professional Services study. This essentially shows the pendulum of cloud adoption. And while we definitely call out 3 distinct areas, it's also our opinion that the pendulum is never static. It's always moving. And that's true for both the market and for enterprise adoption of cloud. We really see professional services adoption playing a big role, though, in 2 key areas, and that's along with private cloud adoption and with hybrid cloud adoption. So with private cloud, there's definitely that need for vendor management of the environment. It helps mitigate some security concerns and some of the complicated communication between the IT and LOB sides of the house. It also helps IT staff to sort of build and manage their own cloud environment should they choose to self-build instead of rely on a provider to host their private cloud environments for them. And for hybrid cloud, there's so much need for integration services and ongoing management of the multi-vendor environment. Each new cloud solution that is purchased needs to be able to be integrated and work with the other cloud solutions that are already existing. And really this is where cloud brokerage and orchestration come in. We've done customer research studies recently on both of those areas of the market, and some of the biggest customer concerns are around, just integrating the technologies and making sure that the technologies, the cloud services that they do buy are optimized and they're getting, the most use out of each solution. So I want to orient you to this slide before I kind of dive in. So this graph shows cloud professional services revenue growth for 1Q15 in comparison with the 1Q14. So the x-axis is year-to-year growth in percentage terms, whereas the y-axis is absolute dollar value growth. And then the size of the bubbles that represent each company is actually the amount of revenue dollars realized in the first quarter of 2015 for each of those companies respectively. So as you can see, the two big orange bubbles really stand out, HP and IBM, and IBM's growth is just untouched by any other competitor in the market. And I do want to make a note that Cognizant, in many segments of the benchmark that we portray, Cognizant was almost off the chart, and that is just inorganic revenue growth due to the acquisition of TriZetto. But overall cloud professional services growth is somewhat in line with peers. So the vendors are categorized with color coding to call out their peer groups so that we can easily see, which peer group is performing better in each segment than others. So what's interesting to me is that, the multi-line cloud vendors are dominating the segment. I think one would think top of mind that, systems integrators would maybe pull ahead in cloud professional services, but this kind of goes to show that, experience with multiple forms of IT, so on-premise, hybrid, virtualized, and what have you, and, just ongoing experience and tenure in IT management definitely helps vendors succeed in this space, and that's why we think HP and IBM are definitely coming out on top. So this slide just shows the overall top 3 revenue and growth leaders in cloud professional services overall. So the order of the vendors as revenue leaders is maps very similar to our IT services benchmark. You have the big 3 leading global SIs right at the forefront of cloud professional services. There's definitely some similarities in their strategies, relying on their past expertise in IT management and implementation that they're really promoting and bringing to market to succeed in this space. And in terms of the growth leaders, what I found interesting was TCS and T-Systems. So we don't typically see them as growth leaders very often in IT services, but in cloud, I think part of that growth leadership is due to the relatively smaller size of their cloud professional services businesses, but also they've definitely been focusing on their areas of strength. So TCS is definitely using its lower price points and legacy outsourcing capabilities to really bring to market its cloud services. And T-Systems is really focusing on its area of core strength, which is those European clients that it knows very well. It's definitely relying on its partners in the region to appeal to the local market there.
One of the interesting things about that last slide is that, if you compare it, for instance, to our IT services benchmark, from a trend standpoint, it's fairly similar. The biggest players, the ones that currently have the largest amount of revenue, they have the biggest challenges in terms of turning in high growth rates. And then you have the up-and-comers, the ones that have started small and are growing much more rapidly. I think one of the key interesting points here is that IBM has managed to sustain growth in cloud at the expense of cannibalization, and they do not appear like this in our IT services benchmark, and yet here in the cloud space they are managing to be very successful from that perspective in terms of growing their cloud business.
Thanks, Ramunas. So now we're going to focus on, where we see as the biggest areas of opportunity and kind of the trends that we've seen over the past 6 or so months in cloud professional services. So we've been talking about it throughout the presentation already, but really the biggest growth area for vendors is the managed services layer. So enterprise cloud environments, they're maturing. There's not as many additions of net new cloud solutions. So now there's definitely that need for vendors to come in and just make everything work, make it all work together and integrated with the on-premise IP and make sure that, you know, everything is monitored and secure. So this graph here is just a historical view of the slide that we showed earlier with the different shades of blue in the market forecasting by segment. So this graph, however, only covers the 29 vendors that are covered in the benchmark. So we estimate that those vendors that we do cover in the benchmark are about the top 40 to 50% of the cloud professional services market. So if you take a look, managed services in 1Q15 grew to the point where it finally surpassed consulting. So now it's second only to systems integration, which often is a precursor to that managed services adoption. So going forward, I'd expect to see managed services to take over as the largest segment in cloud professional services. That is until the next really disruptive wave of cloud professional services adoption, which would kind of start the cycle all over again with a big consulting push, then the integration, and then the managed services. So this slide's similar to the one a little while ago. Again, just orienting you to the chart. So you can see that HP and IBM are kind of off in their own little space up in the top right-hand corner. They definitely dominate the managed services market. You know, as we've been talking about, they have that expertise, they have the tenure, not just in cloud, but in overall IT management. And both companies are definitely taking the approach of saying to either buyers or prospects, you know, hey, we have this entire suite of cloud professional services. Why not choose us? We can advise you on what to choose. We can implement it for you. We can migrate whatever you need from your traditional environment over to the cloud. And hey, look, we can manage it for you, either remote or on-site, you pick. So it kind of makes the customer feel a little bit more empowered, and it also, you know, provides that single point of contact for them. What I also found interesting on this graph here is that you can see the bottom of the graph, everyone's kind of bunched together, and then the systems integrators tend to lead in terms of growth year to year, but are still relatively small in this space. So I think that definitely the next vendor to look out for is Accenture. Accenture has a huge presence in outsourcing, and it has a very strong reputation in the IT services and cloud market. So it's definitely the vendor to watch, in my opinion. So this slide just kind of reiterates the previous one. Again, the order of the leaders is very similar to IT services. And also notice that, you know, the top three revenue leaders in managed cloud services are also those with some of the biggest outsourcing arms in the IT services industry. So those capabilities are translating very well and very easily into the cloud professional services space. TCS, on the other hand, true to form, is definitely playing catch-up in this space, so to speak, you know, really pushing its strengths as a low-cost provider and really bringing that to market to kind of just capture market share right now, and then we'll cross and upsell its other cloud and digital solutions. So now we're going to, we've been discussing some of the vendor standings throughout, but we're really going to take a look at, you know, who the leaders are and really what they've been doing to kind of come out on top in cloud professional services. So this quarter, actually the past 6 months, has been pretty active in cloud acquisitions. There's definitely some market consolidation going on. Some of the smaller, more niche vendors are getting picked up, and kind of just brought in under the wing of a big multi-line vendor, so to speak. They operate as a separate unit, but really help provide those added capabilities. One area I really wanted to point out is the acquisitions around open source. So on the same day, IBM and Cisco each announced an open source acquisition, both specifically focused on private cloud open source. So there's been a lot of talk about bringing open source into the enterprise, but not a lot of movement, and I think that's because there's definitely a perception issue there with bringing an open platform into a data-sensitive enterprise. And also, a lot of enterprises prefer, app development on a dedicated platform, and so I think that that's what IBM and Cisco are both trying to get to in the OpenStack space. I think that there's definitely a real big opportunity for open source in the enterprise, but again, it's very difficult, and that's why I think vendors like Mirantis, who are solely dedicated on, the migration to open source and the services around that, and kind of almost acting like an IT department for the enterprise and dealing with the OpenStack migration. I think that that's very important, and we're going to see a lot more companies like Mirantis pop up and potentially be acquired by these larger companies as well. Something not called out on this slide and is related to open source is the HP planned acquisition of Staccato. That was announced on Tuesday. It's not an OpenStack play, but it is a Cloud Foundry play. So there's definitely big moves being made in open source.
So tying off, so we talked about open source and OpenStack and how that's driving opportunity for the services vendors. The last area to kind of end on here is looking at tying it back to that opportunity around hybrid. Because if you look at the mix of where the types of cloud services that these SIs are providing value around, certainly hybrid is one that we see customers struggling with right now, just in terms of getting their hands around the technology, starting to understand the benefits and how they can actually use the capabilities that are now available in large part within their own organizations, and how that fits with their strategy. It's a big part of the path forward, sustaining sizable growth in terms of the investment in professional services for cloud. And so when we look at some of the leading vendors, or some of the vendors that are at the forefront of enabling hybrid implementations, it's important, obviously, for the service providers. The partnerships here are critical, so that they're really tying it back to the technology that's being used, even if they're not the provider in most cases. It's going to certainly be a multi-vendor approach. When we look at some of the leaders, starting at the top, Microsoft and IBM, really it's all about the breadth there. They're going to look at the multitude of offerings within their own portfolios and provide some hybridization, through their own services, through their own offerings. But for the service providers, the other opportunity really is enabling less vendor lock-in, which we can continue to see on the cloud side cropping up more and more. That for a lot of customers, one of the objectives with cloud is to break the ties to the very strong ties to some of the traditional technology vendors that they feel beholden to, either from a financial standpoint or from a flexibility and an architecture standpoint. That this is the opportunity here is to really enable customer choice and flexibility with the technologies that are being delivered, and from whom they're able to source different elements of that overall solution. With Salesforce, I think it is an example of how the broad engagements are great, but for a lot of it, it's going to be very focused around a certain use case, a certain application, in terms of hybrid and the service capability built up around that. And so looking at kind of, in this case, a CRM-focused integration and hybrid enablement, there are platforms to help there, but also when we looked at the role of a vendor like a MuleSoft or an API management platform, in most cases the need for services does not go away, and that given the way that these solutions are being used, there is still customization and support and implementation help in terms of actually getting that up and running and then getting the benefits from it, that the providers are going to be there to sell around that, but also make use of some of the alliances that vendors like Salesforce have in delivering hybrid technology. And then lastly, with Google and AWS, two vendors that are primarily focused on that public cloud delivery method, don't really have that breadth that IBM and Microsoft do in terms of private and on-prem and all the choice in terms of the way that things are delivered, but are taking a technology-led view in terms of either with open source with Google or AWS looking at some of the networking elements for what's required to truly hybridize. That's their play, and so it's incumbent upon the SIs to be able to latch onto that to support all of the different go-to-market methods. They can be diverse in terms of who they support and who they partner with, but the landscape really is about all these different ways of hybridizing, but we see opportunity with each.
So to conclude, as is typical TBR form, we don't only look at the vendors, but we look at the customers. And hybrid certainly is a future for cloud, a future environment, an environment that's going to come to pass. The results here on this last page are actually from our BI software cloud study. And it was, again, interviewing a number of different enterprise customers in terms of their purchase criteria and decisions and what they are currently using and what they plan to use. And not surprising, many of them are not using hybrid environments, certainly right now for their BI and analytics type at work, but they do plan to be moving into a hybrid environment in the near future. And this opens up, again, the whole question of, is this going to really happen? And our results have historically shown that when customers say they're going to be moving in a certain direction, they typically do. And the BA market really is almost a microcosm of the cloud market. We've seen the same kind of results. It started off that they're all looking at consulting and systems integration and consultants to help them decide what kind of BA applications they wanted to use. Then they used systems and the systems integrators to help them put the systems in place. It's even a little bit more complex in the fact that really you need consultants of various nature and form and shape and size. You need consultants that can really bridge the gap between IT and what you're trying to do with your data. You need PhDs and analysts to actually analyze the data. And then you need consultants to help you translate that data into business outcomes for your business managers and a whole change in the environment of who's actually buying because who's going to be using the information. Hybrid cloud, very complex when you get into that kind of situation. We have 3 different consultants working with you, explaining 3 different aspects of the whole integration process. But it's the future. It's where people, where many customers are heading. They don't want to spend the time and effort to develop the skill sets themselves. They're far more willing to leverage and use services providers, systems integrators, pure consultants, whatever, to do that kind of work, which bodes well for professional services and professional services growth into the future for the cloud market.
So to just kind of wrap up, we just wanted to highlight, reiterate the items that we talked about today. So yes, cloud professional services adoption remains very, very high. It often leads into the public, private, and hybrid cloud adoption, and also it comes full circle and is adopted due to those as-a-service adoptions. Managed services is definitely the segment to look out for over the next year or two. And the vendors to look out for, definitely IBM, Accenture, and HP. But really, As cloud becomes more mainstream, I would expect to see, Microsoft, SAP, and Oracle to continue showing up more as they bring their BI and cloud capabilities together and really address those specific enterprise needs. So now that we've wrapped up, we would like to open it up for questions.
All right, and just a quick reminder, for questions, please send them to the Q&A function, and let's begin. So our first question, for the cloud adoption slide, is there still a difference between North America and Europe uptake/usage of cloud and professional services?
Yep, so great question. We do look into that across all 4 of our cloud studies, so that's professional services, private, hybrid, and public. In front of me, I have the data specifically for professional services, but we do have it for the others as well. But professional services specifically, so North America and Europe tend to behave pretty similarly across the board. The cloud budgets overall are very, very similar, with North America's cloud budgets being just slightly bigger. Cloud professional services adoption, however, it's definitely highest in Asia Pacific. I think that that market trails the more mature markets in terms of IT adoption by a couple of years, so it's right in line with where we would expect it to be right now. Big cloud adoption, full scale, cloud migrations and what have you. In terms of between North America and Europe, adoption rates are almost identical across the board, except for ADM, cloud professional services adoption, which is much, much higher in Europe than in North America.
All right, our next question, what about public cloud? Is growth slowing? Is the professional services opportunity there similar to private cloud and hybrid cloud?
So as with any maturing market, yes, growth is decelerating just as it is in the cloud professional services market like we talked about earlier. But that definitely does not mean that demand for public cloud is going anywhere. It continues to grow. New entrants continue to pop up all the time, and there's always constant innovation, especially in Salesforce and Amazon come to top of mind. There's definitely the opportunity and need for professional services along with public cloud. Again, it goes together with the hybrid IT integrations and what have you. That was just, actually, Allan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. So I think part of what is driving engagements around public cloud is the way that it's being used. We're still seeing shadow IT activity and siloed usage in that way, but we're also seeing more enterprises take a corporate-wide approach that pulls in larger pools of public cloud and larger subscriptions, more complexity, and wants to centrally manage that and control it. So it really brings IT back into the picture in terms of how these services are delivered. And those types of engagements that we're seeing more enterprises kind of go through this transformation stage where it consolidates the usage. It also drives with it services opportunities in terms of helping customers map out what they have, map out the roadmap for the services that are going to be rolled out going forward, and do that in a more centralized way.
All right, well, looks like we only have one more question here. So this is in reference to the chart shown earlier showing BI software adoption and cloud deployments. The question is, what about BI professional services to BI professional cloud services?
I think it's very similar from the standpoint that BI professional services is, from an incident standpoint, actually the starting point and dominates the, from an adoption standpoint. I don't have the numbers actually in front of me right now in terms of the actual figures, but the trend, as I mentioned when I was speaking earlier, is very similar in terms of firms yes, they want to be able to analyze their workloads, the data that they have in-house, figure out what they can do with it, build some intelligence to drive some business outcomes. To do that all on their own is very challenging, and therefore it's driving professional services, assistance from an advisory consulting standpoint, and even from an outsourcing standpoint. We're seeing with firms that are actually in the business process outsourcing arena actually tacking on analytics type capabilities and or providing services around that to integrate basically the output of their outsourcing type work with an analytics view so that they can make better business decisions in the future.
All right, we have one more question come in. We'll take this one. Can you talk a little to multi-cloud and how containers, Docker, are impacting adoption of cloud in general?
Sure. So this is Allan. In terms of the multi-cloud environments, certainly we're seeing that with a growing set of the customers we're interacting with, hybridizing, and not just operating, doing some development on AWS, using some Salesforce subscriptions on the sales and marketing side, but truly looking at use cases where clouds are integrated together and can share resources, share data. That type of really intelligent and managed multi-cloud environment is something that we're seeing right now in a small subset of customers. But with all the conversations, I think there's interest in being able to have, really I think comes down to greater flexibility, but also being able to manage and control the types of cloud services that are used under certain conditions. And so in that context, so hybrid is really in a subset. I think when we look at the use around Docker and containers, very few clients think that's ready for production today. But certainly we're seeing a lot of trialing, a lot of piloting, a lot of work in terms of the development organization. And I also think that a lot of the alliances that are being rolled out in support of Docker will help really grow that over time, because with any of the new services that are being developed on a lot of the cloud platforms, Docker support is now included, and will enable greater flexibility going forward. It may not be, very few customers expect to be able to move seamlessly without, in a very fast way, but they do value that long-term kind of flexibility in terms of moving off certain clouds, migrating to different areas based on price, conditions, needs. Those all change over time. I think most customers know that having at least the possibility for that flexibility will be important for them, and that Docker is one way to help them address and enable that.
All right, so that's all we have for today. I would like to thank our analysts for presenting today, as well as everyone for sending in your questions. You can follow our analysts on our wealth of social media accounts here. So please check out those, as well as our YouTube site for our previous presentations as well. Additionally, before you sign off, I'd like to ask you to take a brief survey about today's presentation, as we're always looking to improve both the information we provide and how we provide it to you. So we'll leave the chat function open for another minute or so for last-minute questions. Otherwise, thank you for attending, and have a great afternoon.